There is a particular kind of hush that falls over a town when animals die without explanation. That hush arrived in Puerto Rico in the mid-1990s, and it had a strange name that fit easily into whispers: Chupacabra. People leaned into the dark imaginations primed by fear and folklore, and suddenly everyone had a story to tell. This video begins with that moment of collective breath holding, because the origin of a legend often reveals more than the legend itself. The story of the Chupacabra is not just about an animal that supposedly drank blood. It is about how communities respond to uncertainty and loss, and how a rumor can travel faster than evidence. The first widely reported incidents occurred in rural areas and had a simple, terrible focus: dead livestock discovered with vicious regularity. Farmers found goats and chickens lying lifeless with puncture wounds and little to no blood remaining at the scene. Each discovery fed another neighbor's fear, and the word Chupacabra began circulating as if it had always been there waiting for a name. Local newspapers and radio picked up the story quickly, and soon the details multiplied like smoke around a campfire. Every retelling added a small flourish, a slightly different description, and what began as a string of plausible animal attacks morphed into something more mysterious and menacing in public imagination. Descriptions of the creature varied wildly from the beginning, giving the Chupacabra a mutable and unnerving identity. Some witnesses described a reptilian, spiky-backed creature with glowing eyes and a strange gait, while others insisted they saw a mangy, hairless canine with exposed ribs and a desperate hunger. The variability in descriptions made the Chupacabra more flexible, allowing it to fit into different fears and narratives across regions. This mutability is important because it turned the Chupacabra into a cultural Rorschach test, taking on whatever local anxieties and imagery people already carried. When a cryptid can be many things at once, it becomes harder to pin down with proof and easier to spread through hearsay and sensational headlines. The livestock attacks themselves became the most chilling evidence for believers, and those reports were disturbingly specific in many cases. Farmers often reported puncture marks on throats or chests, and bodies that seemed drained of blood with no obvious cause or drag marks. Those images fit perfectly into a vampire motif, and the Chupacabra's nickname, the goat sucker, gained traction almost instantly. Yet, investigators noted inconsistencies between supposed blood-drained animals and forensic realities, and this tension between eyewitness testimony and physical evidence would become a recurring theme. The grotesque nature of the scenes made it difficult for communities to step back and apply calm analysis, because grief and anger were the first human responses. News reports and talk radio amplified every fresh account, and the story leapt off the island and into broader Latin America. Within months, similar reports arrived from Mexico, Chile, and parts of the southern United States, creating a pattern that looked like regional contagion. Social networks of families, truck drivers, and migrant workers helped transmit these stories as reliably as newspapers or television did. The speed of the spread is a crucial clue to understanding the phenomenon, because myths do not propagate only through evidence. They travel on connections and anxieties. A single story told at a roadside diner can seed 100 new sightings, once the expectation of danger is planted. Scientists and wildlife biologists stepped into the debate soon after, bringing a very different vocabulary to the scene. Genetic testing teams and veterinarians began examining carcasses and hair samples, trying to find something consistent beneath the folklore. Their reports would later show a surprising diversity of explanations, from mange-ridden coyotes to misidentified domestic dogs, complicating simple answers because the physical evidence often pointed to known animals rather than an unknown predator. The scientific narrative clashed with sensational accounts at every turn. That clash created two communities of belief, one anchored to laboratory tests and the other anchored to narrative and lived experience. One major scientific turning point came when genetic analysis linked many recovered specimens to dogs and coyotes suffering from severe mange. DNA results from several carcasses showed familiar genetic markers, even when the animals looked otherworldly. The combination of fur loss, skin thickening, and malnourishment produces grotesque forms that can easily be read as monstrous by untrained observers. This explanation did not satisfy everyone because the narrative power of a new predator is stronger than lab results for many people. But the scientific explanation offered a parsimonious account that matched both the physical remains and known environmental pressures on wildlife in many regions. Beyond biology, there were other theories that helped the Chupacabra legend flourish, and some of them were far stranger than a sick dog. Fringe explanations ranged from escaped laboratory experiments to alien landings, each theory appealing to a specific cultural appetite for conspiracy. These alternatives often gained traction where institutional trust was low and official explanations felt inadequate or dismissive. Conspiracy thrives in gaps, and when local authorities could not immediately offer a comforting explanation, people filled those gaps with narratives that suited their worldviews. Monsters like the Chupacabra can be as much about mistrust of institutions as they are about the creatures themselves. Media played a complicated role, sometimes clarifying and often inflating the story in equal measure. Sensational headlines and late-night talk shows prioritized fear because fear sells, and that attention gave the Chupacabra a life beyond any single eyewitness. The image of a vampiric, alien-like creature was irresistible to producers and listeners alike, creating a feedback loop that amplified every new claim. At the same time, investigative journalism and skeptical reporting slowly chipped away at the mystery by tracing hoaxes, showing forensic evidence, and interviewing veterinarians. That dual nature of media amplifier and debunker was essential to the legend's life cycle and eventual transformation into cultural iconography. Cultural context mattered deeply to how the Chupacabra was received and retold across regions of the Americas. In Latin America, a long history of supernatural beliefs about creatures and spirits provided a ready interpretive framework for modern sightings. Those traditions gave the Chupacabra symbolic potency, allowing it to speak to older fears about predators, colonization, and vulnerability in rural life. When a community has a cultural lexicon of monsters and omens, new phenomena slot into old frameworks very rapidly. That is why the Chupacabra did not remain an isolated headline, but became a recurring presence in local stories, festivals, and artistic expressions. The myth quickly entered popular culture and became a malleable symbol in television, music, and internet culture. Filmmakers and musicians used the Chupacabra as shorthand for exotic danger or misunderstood creatures, turning fear into entertainment, memes, and late-night segments later distilled the Chupacabra into an icon that could be joked about or fetishized depending on the audience. This pop cultural afterlife mattered because it normalized the creature and preserved the myth even as scientific explanations circulated. Once a legend is embedded in entertainment, it gains a momentum independent from the original reports and can survive repeated debunking. Sociologists point out that economic and political instability often create fertile ground for monster stories to grow and spread. In communities facing economic stress, livestock losses hit harder and require a scapegoat for the sudden sense of vulnerability. When institutions cannot provide quick relief or credible explanations, rumor and myth become practical forms of collective coping and moral accounting. This social function of myths explains why the Chupacabra narrative had staying power even as the physical evidence became less convincing. The legend offered a narrative structure in which losses were meaningful and agents of harm could be imagined, named, and opposed. Psychology also played a central role because humans are wired to detect patterns and to seek explanations for threatening events. Once the idea of a predator that drained blood entered the cultural bloodstream, observers became primed to notice and remember anything that fit that pattern. Expectation biases and memory distortions turned ambiguous animal remains into dramatic proof for many witnesses. Mass psychology does not make eyewitnesses dishonest. It makes them human and vulnerable to cognitive shortcuts under stress. Understanding these mechanisms is essential to separating narrative enchantment from reliable evidence in any case of alleged monsters. Field investigations sometimes revealed hoaxes, because notoriety can be lucrative and notoriety can also be a form of protest. There were documented cases where injuries were self-inflicted or staged to attract media attention or to shame authorities for inaction. Those incidents further complicated the story because they confirmed a fear of fraud while simultaneously feeding the legend's notoriety. Hoaxes are a blunt demonstration of how narrative incentives shape reality. and they remind us that human actors often have motives beyond simple belief. When a town becomes famous for a monster, the line between sincere testimony and opportunistic fabrication becomes perilously thin. Comparing the Chupacabra to older folklore reveals a continuity in human myth-making about creatures that prey on livestock. From vampire legends in Eastern Europe to South American tales of spectral dogs, cultures historically created cautionary monsters to explain threats to food and livelihood. The Chupacabra fits into that long tradition, adapting older motifs to modern anxieties and media environments. This historical perspective matters because it shows the Chupacabra was not born in a vacuum. It was the latest chapter in a global story about vulnerability to predators. Folklore evolves rather than emerges fully formed, borrowing motifs and reshaping them for present-day contexts. If we look at the forensic record, a clear pattern emerges in favor of known animals affected by disease or malnutrition. Many recovered chupacabras were later identified as dogs, foxes, or coyotes suffering from mange starvation. These conditions warp familiar bodies into unfamiliar forms, producing creatures that frighten in part because they appear halfway between life and collapse. That explanation requires compassion because it reframes the chupacabra from a malevolent hunter to a symptom of ecological stress and human-animal interaction. It is a less thrilling story than alien predators, but it is more useful for preventing future livestock losses and for addressing wildlife health. Still, not every sighting is easily categorized, and part of the chupacabra's allure is its remaining capacity to unsettle. Unexplained livestock deaths continue to occur occasionally, and when they do, old narratives reawaken quickly. The persistence of the legend is a testament to human appetite for mystery where knowledge is incomplete. The modern world produces plenty of mysteries despite our scientific advances, mostly because complexity can outpace explanation for a time. In those gaps, legends like the Chupacabra serve as communal storybooks where people rehearse their fears and their hopes for control. The Chupacabra also reveals the power of language to create a thing into existence, because naming an animal changes how it is perceived and discussed. Once the label Chupacabra existed, the phenomenon gained a unified narrative that could travel across borders easily. That naming made disparate events legible to strangers and allowed communities to borrow a shared set of meanings quickly. Language can thus act as both scalpel and scaffold. It can cut through confusion with classification, and it can build the frameworks that make myths durable. The Chupacabra is a study in how a single word can anchor a multi-regional story. Artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs quickly repurposed the Chupacabra into merchandise and cultural reference points, turning fear into commerce. From t-shirts to local festivals, the creature migrated into a form of cultural capital that towns could trade on. This commodification softened the monster's edges in some places, making it more carnival than curse in parts that leaned into tourism. Commercialization changes the social meaning of myths because profitability incentivizes preservation and reinvention. When a town realizes that a monster attracts visitors, it can transform a source of trauma into an economic story with different effects on the community's identity. Internationally, the Chupacabra became shorthand for the unknowns that move through modern life, especially in times of rapid change and migration. Migrant routes and media circuits allowed the legend to hop borders, and local conditions shaped each version into something regionally meaningful. The creature's adaptability made it useful as a narrative tool for explaining everything from agricultural loss to existential dread. In that sense, the Chupacabra is less a creature and more a cultural instrument, a method for naming the anxieties of the age. It functions as an interpretive lens through which communities interpret disruptions to their routines and livelihoods. What can we learn from this story in practical terms about investigating mysterious phenomena in the future? First, rigorous fieldwork and timely forensic analysis are indispensable for separating animal disease from invention. Rapid scientific response, paired with transparent communication, reduces the fertile ground on which myths grow by replacing rumor with credible data swiftly. Second, an awareness of social and cultural dynamics helps investigators communicate respectfully and effectively with affected communities. People are grieving when livestock die. And scientific explanation must be paired with empathy, not disdain, if it hopes to displace persistent myths. In the end, the Chupacabra legend is less about a single monster and more about the stories people tell to make sense of the world. The animal that frightened Puerto Rican evenings in the 1990s was a nexus of biology, media, psychology, and culture, and that complexity is what makes the narrative so revealing. When we trace the legend's path across continents, we are really tracing human responses to fear and uncertainty. Those responses matter because they show how communities negotiate reality in moments of crisis, choosing between myth and method, suspicion and science. The Chupacabra survives in memory not because of its teeth, but because stories are resilient and because humans prefer meaning over randomness. Here is the philosophical twist. Monsters like the Chupacabra reveal the contours of our trust more than the limits of nature. When institutions, science, and leaders fail to provide timely aid or credible explanations, myth-making steps in to fill that vacuum with narratives people can use. The result is not merely false belief. It is a social mechanism for processing damage and asserting agency in the face of loss. That insight reframes the legend from a cautionary tale about gullibility to a mirror showing how societies manage uncertainty and vulnerability. The Chupacabra therefore teaches us about the human condition as much as it entertains us with its scares. If this exploration gave you a different way to look at modern myths, then you are not alone in your curiosity. The Chupacabra started as a whispered name and became a multifaceted phenomenon that illuminates media, science, and human psychology in equal measure. Understanding that arc helps us see how to respond differently the next time a new monster appears at the edges of our towns and feeds our anxieties. If this video sparked a new perspective, hit subscribe for more narratives that trace the hidden logic behind famous stories. Thank you for watching, and remember that the scariest monsters are sometimes the stories we tell about ourselves.